We're going to be hearing from Michael Koelle about work from home in 20 different countries.
All right. Thank you very much. And let me start this last session of the conference by thanking the organizer for putting together this wonderful event that we've had the privilege to attend for the last 3 days. It's really been nice. And of course, thank you for including this paper. So this academic paper that I'm going to present is actually the outcome of a policy collaboration that we had between what was back then our team at the OECD and Indeed way back in 2021 during the pandemic, when we were interested in monitoring labor market trends and remote work across countries. And so my co-authors are my colleagues Gabriele and Cyrille from the OECD. I'm Michael, and 3 co-authors from the Indeed Hiring Lab, which is the research arm of the job site Indeed. Alexandre, Pawel, and Tara. And Tara has since moved to the United States government. So before I say anything else, I should note that anything I'm going to say is only a position of the authors and should not be attributed to Indeed, the OECD member countries, the US government, or the US Department of the Treasury. A long disclaimer in this case. Okay, so the basic question of this paper is how has the pandemic catalyzed the surge in working from home? Now, of course, especially to this audience, it's clear that something has happened. We're not back at stage 1 where we were 3 years ago. But then we also know that from some data sources, we get the impression working from home has peaked. Maybe it's going back. Some employers are recalling their workers to the offices. And moreover, a lot what we know about working from home, we know it from the United States. I think the discussions at the conference again attest to this. However, the pandemic was global, so it affected labor markets in many countries. And this is what we're going to shed light on for 20 countries. And we use data from the job site Indeed. So Indeed is the largest job site in many markets. We're covering these 20 countries and extracting data from about 1.5 billion job month postings on Indeed. The data is not only cross-country and high frequency at a monthly level, but it's also classified into economic sectors, basically occupations mostly, that allows them to do an analysis, a different type analysis, where we exploit these 3 margins of variation, so across countries, across time, and across occupations with high and low working from home potential, to then estimate the causal effect of the pandemic on advertised working from home, distinguishing between periods of pandemic easing and pandemic tightening. And that will matter as you see. So this graph, this descriptive chart here, basically tells the main story and shows the main findings. So what you see here in blue is our time series of advertised working from home. So that's in the average country, the share of job ads on Indeed that mention the possibility of working from home. And as you see, this increased from 2.5% to 3% just before the pandemic to 11.5% in March. That's the latest data point on this chart. Now, 2 hours ago, my co-author updated our publicly available data series up to August. And so the data point for August is 11.2%, right? So basically, in the last half year, this has stayed ever up at close to 11.5%. And then secondly, advertised working from home went up. You can also see here, we have in red here one measure of pandemic stringency. And you see the difference of like lockdowns, and every time is a lockdown, basically the work from home share inches up, right? This is across countries. Of course, we're going to do that in the accurate analysis at a much more fine-grained level, but basically the story is the same. Whenever there's a new lockdown, working from home goes up. When there's easing of pandemic restrictions, this doesn't go down again. Okay, so a word about the related literature. So as I said, our measure is advertised working from home. So basically, we interpret that as a commitment by the firm to make working from home available to workers. So also you should note that in many jurisdictions, what you mentioned, a job ad has legal implications, right? So it's important enough that the firm feels it is worth mentioning to a potential worker in a job ad. So contrast to survey measures, this doesn't capture the sort of like ad hoc adoption of working from home in the early stages of the pandemic when everybody was sent home to work there. Now, a few papers, and we have to expand this discussion here, has used online job postings in single countries. One paper by Nick and Steve and co-authors also looks at across countries, across 5 Anglophone countries. And I think these 2 papers are closely related, not only because of the cross-country perspective, but also because they take 2 different, but in the end, complementary approaches to measuring online job postings, measuring working from home from online job postings. As you will see, this is not as straightforward as one might think. There's some complications attached to that, so these need to be dealt with. And in 2 different ways, I think we arrive basically at the same conclusions. Okay, so let me first talk about the data and about measurement, and I spent some time on there because I thought this might be of interest. So as I said, we have 20 countries. So Indeed has a job portal. I'll show you a screenshot in a minute, country by country. These are 20 countries, a bunch of countries from Europe, all countries in North America, Israel, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. So if you think about the pandemic, these are countries where the pandemic unfolded in very, very different ways, right? They locked down harsher or earlier, or some could open up earlier, had to lock down again, etc. So you have all these different varieties of pandemic experiences. And also we cover 11 languages, right? So we need to find a way to deal with multiple languages. Basically, we identify working from home using keywords in the job title, description, or location in all of these languages, right? And in the latest version of the paper, we also include hybrid keywords. So that's kind of like the examples are in the second row here, that basically are specific words to identify, specific language to identify sort of like hybrid work arrangements. We tested quite extensively sort of like to figure out what words exactly to use in all the different languages. And the main variable then we construct is the share of job postings that advertise working from home at the country occupation month level. This is the data set we do analysis on. This is also the data set that's publicly available now until August on our website. Okay, so Indeed, their business model is basically for job seekers to go on their website and find jobs and apply through that, and for firms to want to advertise because the job seekers are there, okay? This results in a very high quality of every single job posting, because the business model is not aggregate, sort of like analyzing aggregate trends, but having a good quality job posting for every single job. So when you go in Indeed, and this is a country-specific website, this is an example from the UK. You type in a job title, you type in a location, you click on find, then you're basically going to get a list of different jobs. And also to help a job search for the job seekers, the pointer here. Yeah, you have sort of like these fields here that allow the job seeker to narrow down. This is metadata that's extracted from the posting, or indeed when an employer posts a job that the employer basically provides, okay? And so how does a job posting look like? This is one job posting during the pandemic. So you have job title, you have the location, you have some other fields, and basically have a long sort of like text of job description. And here I want to draw your attention to the part at the bottom of the job description. And this is data that basically, that's employer provided metadata that Indeed then adds sort of like to the text. So this is data that sort of like helps you to narrow down your job search, but it's also added and for completeness information to the text. That includes the job type, the contract type, benefits here, in this case, a specific requirement about the license, driving license. And then crucially, in the last 2 rows, it says work remotely : no. And this is a field that Indeed added during the pandemic, basically to help job seekers navigate the labor market, but that from a perspective of a researcher poses some issues that we have to deal with. So if we just do the keyword search as I described until so far, we get the following picture, and this is again across countries. So what you see here, basically, when Indeed adds this employer-provided metadata, both in the positive and in the negative, if you only search for keywords such as work remotely or remote or whatever it is, you're going to get basically a huge jump that's going to pick up all of these false negatives, right? At some point, this goes down. That corresponds to a time period when Indeed changed the wording of this location question. So it's not work remotely no anymore. It's now differently. This was rolled out across countries in a staggered way, so you have this sort of like gradual decline. Okay, but what you have basically before anything else is applied is this picture. To me, it reminds me of if you know The Little Prince, the book. There's a drawing of like the snake that ate the elephant. This to me is like the elephant in the snake broth, right? And this is the typical thing. And if you do that, say in burning glass light cast data, you basically get the same thing. Okay, so how do we correct for this? Well, we use the information that I just described to you, how this metadata comes in the job postings in the first place. Right, so we know that Indeed added work remotely : no in the United Kingdom and different things in other countries. We basically use that information to undo, in a sense, these false positives. Okay, and then we get basically the blue line, which is in a sense is the line I showed you in an earlier vintage, but the line that I showed you in the first graph. Okay. I just want to be clear is that this is how we've always done, but we've never, in the first versions of our papers, we didn't explain all the full details, mostly thinking that this would be something that's, sort of like behind the scenes happening in the Indeed sort of like proprietary database. But as of course, we learned since from people in this room, this is something actually an issue that sort of like probably through Indeed sort of like is inherited by lots of other online job postings databases, right? So everybody who works with online job postings in a way has to confront this. Okay, so this is one thing about measurement. Another issue that's also raised in the literature is what I call false friends. The fact that basically, especially in the English language, you use very casual words, working from home, remote work, working remotely to describe these arrangements. But of course, you can come up with examples of strings of text where you have these words in a different meaning. Okay? I would argue that this is less of a concern in many other languages, partly because many languages use dedicated words to describe sort of like working from home arrangements. So you have the first two examples of German and Italians that use what linguists call pseudo-Anglicisms. So these are English words that are borrowed by that language in a meaning that an English speaker wouldn't even recognize, right? So in Germany, that's home office. Everybody knows that this is working from home. In Italy, it's smart working. And it's basically these words in these languages that describe these kinds of arrangements, and there's no sort of like room for misinterpretation. Furthermore, many other languages basically use this artificial word telework, and basically have tele plus their own word for work together, and this describes these arrangements. For some reasons in the English language, although we now know that this has existed for 50 years, but it hasn't really stuck to people's usage. Okay, so I want to be clear also that our methodology does not sort of like allow to correct for this false friends problem, but again, we view this as less of an issue than in many of the other languages. We basically do a robustness check where we're going to include English-speaking countries, and the results fully go through. Okay, so after this part about the measurement, let me then go to the econometric strategy that we have. So we're going to marry a difference type of approach with something that's very common in the applied macro literature, which is called the local projection method. So this is a way of identifying the impulse response of a shock in a setting where you basically have many shocks happening at many different times. So you don't have a nice sort of like event study before and after, but many shocks, you still want to see what's the sort of like the unit effect of a shock. And so on the left-hand side, what you're going to have is the K period change in the share of job postings, advertising working from home in country I, occupation J, and time T. And K is months, and basically this window goes up over time. It's separate regressions for each, but that basically allows you then to plot the coefficients as an impulse response function. Okay? On the right-hand side, we're going to have the variables that denote increases and decreases in pandemic severity at the country level, country month level, interacted with a predetermined occupation level working from home potential that we take from literature from Dingle and Nyman and crosswalk it to our occupation categories. So this is basically the three types of difference that we exploit. And then we're going to include two types of fixed effects. First of all, taking advantage of the fact that we're at the sub-country at the occupation level, we're going to put in country time fixed effects. So these vary at the same level as the pandemic measure, right? So they pick up anything that's unobserved at the country level about the pandemic that might be correlated with the pandemic. Think about seasonality. Think about many other things that happen at the country level, okay? And basically, we're going to then compare occupations with low and high working from home potential in the same country. And in a sense, occupations with low working from home potential serve as a counterfactual to what would have happened in occupations with high working from home potential in absence of the pandemic. Okay, this counterfactual we can condition it in one dimension because we're left-hand side remember is a difference. We put in occupation country fixed effects. These control for trends. So we're going to control for linear occupation country trend. Okay, so we allowed it basically before the pandemic. Say IT jobs in the US were on a different trend to IT jobs in France or to cleaning jobs in Belgium, as an example, right? Okay, so that's the identification assumption. It's a different diff, so we can provide evidence of pre-trends. Actually, the evidence points to a stricter version of the assumption probably being true, parallel trends. This is a standard parallel trends graph. You basically have the outcome on level fixed effects and then the month dummies. You see basically before the pandemic, there was no clear pre-trend. As soon as the pandemic hits, basically the high working from home potential occupations hit off. Okay, so then the results, and as I said, we present them in these impulse response functions. So first on the left-hand side, what you see here is the differential effect of a change in a one standard deviation change of pandemic severity measured by Google Mobility on advertised from home, working from home between occupations with a high and a low potential. There's a relative effect, not an absolute effect. What we see basically, a month after impact, you have a significant effect that goes up, and stabilizes at around so like 4 or 5 months after. And the effect size basically for a unit standard deviation changes is about 0.8 percentage points. To put that into perspective, the first lockdown, so like between February and April 2020, on average across country corresponds to 6 standard deviations increases in severity. Okay, that's just so like to give you a ballpark of what that estimate means in size. Then by contrast, if you look at decreases in pandemic severity, basically we find nothing. Okay, so the pandemic catalyzed the increase in working from home, but didn't undo it when the pandemic went back. This is a result, and basically then we do a bunch of robustness variants of the same result that don't change anything meaningfully. And we have alternative measures for different variables. We can use them all. Changes in the lag structure, that's what people do with this kind of methodology. This then we exclude health occupations in the baseline. We can include them. We can control for health outcomes. We exclude English-speaking countries, what I said before. We have different ways of clustering. We run a placebo test on 2019. So we present the pandemic happened in 2019 in the same months and basically see whether we find anything. No, we don't. So I, for example, was worried about seasonality possibly playing a role. Apparently, no, it doesn't seem to be a major driver. We do separate analysis before and after the vaccination campaign. Maybe expectations of people might have been different. Doesn't really any difference that shows up here. Use different vintages of our data. Basically, the results all go through. Okay, so to conclude, we documented in this paper a 4-fold increase in the share of online job postings across 20 countries that advertise working from home, and that has not been reversed to date. And to date, basically meaning end of last month. This suggests that pandemic triggered some kind of path dependency through different mechanisms. And we're at the conclusion here, so we're not going to provide evidence about this mechanism. I think the data really doesn't allow us to say a lot about this, so we can only speculate about them. I think especially the last paper in the program will talk about that. So the implication, of course, is that working from home is here to stay. There are many implications for firms, workers, cities, and the macroeconomy, as we have seen, and we continue adopting to that. With that, thanks very much, and looking forward to questions.
That was great. Obviously, no one liked the paper. One question I'm going to ask somebody, I can't remember who asked it on the first day about, there's a bunch of, we have the same issue with Hansen. I mean, everyone has the same issue, which is there are some things that obviously allow work from home, but don't say it in the job ad, like assistant professors, whereby, but I don't know how to deal with it actually. And what I was interested in is particularly that early period, you had the work from home allowed, yes, no. It's quite useful actually, that covers all jobs. And I guess, was the share, does every job have that field? Because that's like forces you to answer it. The problem is when it's not spoken, because with assistant professors, if you look at job openings for economists, clearly it would be yes if it had it. Actually, I don't know what would have said. It's interesting, if Stanford put out a job posting, what would we have said? We probably said no, because we mean that you have to come in like at least to teach, but you're, yeah, I don't know. That was one question. The other question was on what you saw in the international variation, but that was more just a data question. But on the first, I don't know if you had thoughts on when you had that field, how to deal with it. We have the same issue. It's actually really hard to think about how it quite shows up.
Yeah, no, thanks. Is a very good point. So this field, we have that for all the job postings that are posted actively by employers, which is not all the job postings on Indeed, because they're sourced from a variety of sources. That share varies across the pandemic. I think at the high point is about 50%. It's a bit lower in other instances. And this is actually, this is the source also of the false positives, right? Only what's posted by employers. So that's the first answer to the question. So we have that for a subset. Is not sort of like by occupation or by anything like that, but for a subset of job postings. I mean, we have 55 occupational categories. They don't correspond to any standards of like occupational classification, and they're detailed in the paper, but they vary a bit. So on some occupations they're very detailed, IT occupations, engineers, for example, and some others are very coarse. So I think we couldn't identify assistant professors or maybe even academics.
It would be great to just redo it just for ones where they have the field, actually, just to see what it looks like for that subset, because for that subset, they're forced to either say yes, no. The problem is when they don't say the way, it's slightly opaque, actually. So you could redo it for the subset where they're forced to say yes or no. It would be good to see what share that was.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I mean, as far as I remember, basically both of these subsets have similar trends. So there doesn't seem to be a big difference across them, but yeah, it's a very good suggestion. Thank you.
So you, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. I heard that Indeed provide access to the applicant data. Maybe that's just a rumor, but someone told me that. So I wondered if you've looked at that at all or done any work, and if there's any trends, if you have, and who's applying to these jobs and locations in particular.
Yes. No, short answer, no, we're not looking at applicant data at all in this project.
So your measure of pandemic severity is just mobility. Is that right?
So what I presented here is mobility.
Right.
The alternative measure is coded government restrictions.
Well, they're different.
So like mobility restrictions,
Mobility
laws
so
that are
that's what I
coded up.
wanted to get to. Have you made an effort to parse out the partial effect of government mandates or restrictions on mobility and activity apart from what you've got is is the Google mobility measure, right? Which is a reflection of what people do voluntarily and businesses do voluntarily, plus what they're mandated to do by the government. But a simple approach would simply be to add into that current specification the restrictions on commercial and social activity, which I think you have for all or almost all of these countries. And then ask whether there's a separate marginal effect of that and whether it looks different. So
yeah, so what I just put up, this is the equivalent graph using basically the government restrictions index. So this is now not Google mobility. This is the other measure.
okay.
So basically, qualitatively it looks the same. I think we think of both of these measures as being highly correlated in a sense. Google mobility.
They are correlated, of course, but I want to know whether there's a marginal effect of you can anticipate well, why might there be a separate marginal effect? Because if the government is imposing restrictions on activity above and beyond what people are voluntarily doing, that might have implications for future government behavior that would lead firms to make investments or decisions to adopt this new technology. So it's a simple expansion of your existing specification. And I wonder whether there's enough power in the data to sort these out.
Yeah, I mean, I want to say the wrong thing. I think we tried, and I think there's not a lot of power. But definitely something we can look at again.
It's worth saying that too.
What I can tell you is we can control for health outcomes. So we're worried basically it's sort of like the health situation as such sort of like also plays a role. So that we can partial out or control for it in addition to either Google mobility or this measure. And basically that doesn't change anything.
Yeah, that's consistent with what I've seen in other settings. The direct health measures don't take you very far.
One on the metadata and then follow up on. So for federal employment in the United States, you have to go through, not through Indeed, but you go through another site called USA Jobs. And USA Jobs, as of summer of 2022, now has a remote as a setting. So when you're posting a job, you must say, is it location specific or telework negotiable or remote? Okay. And so we can search on that for exactly the stuff you're talking about, just to something Nick was saying earlier. That's an option. And then to Ben's comment earlier, I think there's an interesting thing here. I think I heard you say you don't do this, but I think there's an interesting thing to be able to use the same information and talk to whoever was, I don't know if she's here today, the person who did the digital nomad piece, to track and see, does a person with a profile on Indeed change from position in location 1 to a position in location 2, going through different postings in Indeed. There could be some interesting trending things there.
Yeah, thank you.
So building on that, so I thought Ben's suggestion was very helpful because, in terms of mechanisms, I wonder if you can test some demand side mechanisms. So conditional on the same wage or other observable characteristics of the job. Do you see more applications for these remote job postings? And that could just shed some light on, why the firms are posting more, right?
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, we can go on to the next one if there aren't additional questions.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, we're gonna have Victoria Vernon talking about remote work, wages and hours.
Hi, this is joint work with Sabrina Pabilonia from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, and none of this represents the view of Bureau of Labor Statistics. All mistakes are ours. We'll talk about remote work, wages and hours worked in the United States. This work is based on American Community Survey. Our research questions are, do remote workers earn higher or lower wages than on-site workers? Do they work longer or shorter hours? How do remote workers differentials, how did it change over time throughout the pandemic? How did hours of work of remote workers change compared to on-site workers? Do trends vary by gender or by some other characteristics? And whether the wages of remote workers grow slower or faster, or grown slower or faster than the wages of on-site workers, and how that relates to the inflation. So based on the American Community Survey, on a sample of full-time, full-year employees, the share of those who work primarily from home has increased steadily from 2010 over to 2019 and then shot up. So our shares are based on the commute question answer. So how did the person usually get to work last week? So if the person worked primarily from home, even being a remote worker, not necessarily a full-time remote worker, but hybrid worker, a couple of times a week at home, no, couple of times a week at work on site, that would still be considered a home-based worker. So work from home. So we see the share of women is larger than the share of men who worked at home, but on average, it's about 20%. We compare it to the American Time Use Survey, and I've seen that the trends are largely the same, even though the Time Use Survey doesn't measure the share of workers, but measures the share of work days by full-time remote workers, by full-time, full-year workers. So it's based on the work days, slightly larger share, but the trends are the same. So back to the American Community Survey. If you split respondents by occupation, then you'll see that the most teleworkable occupations are, no surprise, computer and mathematical. So from 2019 to 2021, the share of remote workers has increased to more than half of workers, the report being remote. So in business and financial operations, arts and design, legal, the increase is tremendous, and more than 30% of workers consider themselves are home-based. So we call those white collar occupations, those where more than 10% of workers in 2021 are remote, and the rest are either healthcare or blue collar occupation. So theoretically, how can the wages of remote worker differ from those of on-site workers? Well, there could be a penalty because of the compensating wage differential, because working from home is an amenity, and therefore people are willing to pay for it and give up some wages. We can also hypothesize that less productive workers may be selected into work from home. Some of us have done more research on that. Then workers are less productive because there might be children running around. However, there might be an opposite story at play, and there might be a premium for work from home people. I'd say because work from home increased workers' productivity due to reduced commute. Maybe there's a better work environment now and people are better able to do their job. The cost for employers also decreased, and now the employers may be willing to share some of the cost reduction with workers. the cost for working from home has increased for employees, therefore they should be compensated for that a little bit through higher wages. And there might be finally a social isolation impact of work from home, and therefore it's a disamenity, not an amenity. So what has been done before? We know that Ottinger and White both wrote papers on similar topics, and Ottinger looked at workers from 1980 and over to up to 2014, and prior to the 21st century, there was a penalty for working from home, which changed to a small premium by 2014. So Barrero and all have shown that wage growth is lower in high work from home jobs, which may lead to lower inflation. Our sample looks at workers aged 25 to 64, full-time, non-farm sector, and we dropped some observations with wages below $3. Nominal wage trends and real wage trends show that on average, real wages for remote workers have increased over time, whereas for non-remote workers have slightly kind of was the same, but went slightly down over the last couple of years. Wage premiums unadjusted, this is mean wages, mean differences in wages between remote and on-site workers have increased in all but one occupation. Only healthcare support still had a wage penalty in 2021. But overall, 22 out of 23 occupations have a wage premium on average, and especially large in sales. And it actually used to be, even before the pandemic, sales had a very large wage premium. I'm assuming these are real estate agents and other. Actually, I was gonna point out legal occupations used to have a penalty and now have a pretty large premium for remote work. Usual weekly hours of work. So these are reported usual weekly hours of work. They converged over time. So it used to be that remote workers work 2 hours longer per week than on-site workers, and it's no longer the case. They work the same number of hours. We estimate usual wage regressions. So for each year, we estimate the effect of being a remote worker with the usual set of controls for age, quadratic in age, number of children, number of older children, teenage children, number of adult family members, indicators for education, race, Hispanic heritage, married, cohabiting status, disability, living with a partner with a disability, or having a parent with a disability, being a government employer, and then controlling for 21 occupations, 19 industry, and state fixed effects. So the full set of controls. And all we're interested in that first row of results, where we'll present it in the form of the thick lines on the graph, year by year. And then the thin line on the graph, not the blurry line, will be our attempt to estimate Oster beta. So what that is a measure that allows us to attempt to control for the unobservable in the regressions, or a lot of unobservables in the regressions. So the regular wage regression does not allow us to control for a lot of things, like the size of the firm, the size of the city, workers' motivation, workers' tech skills, right? A lot of things, even simple workers' tenure is not available in the data. So if we were to assume that the selection on unobservables is the same size as the selection of unobservables, we can estimate the Oster beta and consider it kind of like a lower bound on our coefficient. So the estimates are robust to omitted variable bias if the bound is not including zero, essentially. So for men and women, what we could see is that the simple wage regressions show that the premium for remote workers have increased both for men and women and have become, in fact, very large over the last couple of years during the pandemic. And there's probably evidence that there's more selection among men. As you see, the Oster beta is negative, but less selection among women. Let's move on. So we do the same analysis by groups. So separately for various occupations. And what we see is that the remote work wage premium is highest in sales, about 20%, then in management, production, arts design, and it's almost non-existent in, let's say, building grounds maintenance, and actually there is a penalty in healthcare support still by occupation. But overall, the wage premium is about 14%, so on average. And these are by the difference by occupation. So by white collar and blue collar occupation, you could see the difference, 14% in 2021 among white collar occupation, but very small, about 4% among blue collar and healthcare occupations. We use the composition similar to Oaxaca and the kind that Adrjan also uses in his paper to figure out whether the total change in remote employment share is due to within or between occupation changes, and it turns out it's due to changes in remote employment shares within occupations. And then the second decomposition asked whether the total change in mean log wage gap between remote and on-site workers is due to various factors, and we find that it's mostly due to the mean observed skill gap between remote workers and on-site workers, as well as due to remote wage premium within occupations. So we don't find that there is any occupational shift overall in the economy, but within occupations. Biparental status, also where we might expect that mothers could be paying wage penalty, they're not. We don't see any evidence of that. Mothers and fathers, all groups which have experienced an increase in wage premium. These are white collar workers too. Over time, then among white collar workers, we further split the sample into, let's say, fathers of smaller children, younger children, mothers of younger children, older children, college, no college, Black, Hispanic, Asian, no disability, private and public sector. And we do see some important heterogeneities here. For example, Black workers versus white receive a lower wage premium for working from home or remote work. Then workers with disability versus no disability also receive a lower wage premium. Government employees, surprisingly or not, also receive lower wage premium. But yes, we do notice that some groups that could be called marginalized, let's say maybe even you could put mothers of younger children into this category, but maybe we don't, because the 12% wage premium Now this is the regression coefficient. The premium itself would be what? The exponent, right? It's like -1 times 100%, or almost that high, a little bit higher than this number, right? If you convert it. But all of these categories still receive a wage premium, not a penalty. So hours differential, we do a similar analysis and notice that the hours have gone down, but these changes in hours are small, relatively small. If the changes in wages are huge, the changes in hours are small. And we could see that like in some occupations, the hours actually increased, personal care services, healthcare support, but in some occupations have decreased, like legal, protective services, agriculture, and all. So white collar occupations, the increase was, I guess the increase was pretty strong in the blue collar occupation too, but we see it in both. And it affected both groups of people by parental status, especially fathers, more than mothers. So the hours, we don't see that much of an increase in hours. Well, for mothers, the hours differential for fathers is stronger, right? So fathers who work remotely, they work less, whereas mothers don't. Then we do some analysis by subsamples and see that government employees actually reduce their hours, but fathers of young children have reduced their hours more than other groups, and fathers of not so young children also. Our final part of the analysis is to use occupational level data rather than personal level. We aggregate by occupation and by remote, non-remote groups, and use 2019 and 2021 data to ask the question whether wages grew faster or slower for remote workers relative to office-based workers between occupations. And these are occupation level regression, where where we have a control for remote status and interacted with 2021, and in some regressions we don't add mean demographic control, mean industry control, and some we do, and we find that the growth in remote wages times in 2021 has been positive. So the wages grew faster in 2021 remote wages. It's about 4% faster than non-remote. We also look at the wage growth and how it relates to the share of remote work within occupation in 2021. There is a tiny relationship, so it's almost like a straight line, and the equation is on the graph. So we see that the average percent of remote workers across occupations increased by about 15% during the pandemic. So we conclude that the rise in remote work is associated with about less than half of a percentage point increase in occupation level wage growth. So very small contribution to occupation level wage growth. So the key takeaways is that there was a substantial jump in the wage premium for remote workers during the pandemic, and primarily remote workers earned 14% more than office-based workers. So the average real wages grew 4.4% faster for remote workers than for office-based workers within detailed occupation groups. The percentage of remote workers during the pandemic is positively correlated with the growth in occupation level wages. Usual weekly hours of remote workers decreased steadily, and the data supports productivity effects more than the compensating wage differential story. Okay, your questions.
Yeah, great work. One piece of corroborating evidence I feel behind your productivity story might come from the BEA data, right? So they break down productivity by industry, and I understand industry probably doesn't map perfectly into your categories, but for some of them it probably does, like legal and so forth. So if you observe that productivity across industries kind of lines up with the fraction of workers in that industry that are remote, so if industries that have more remote workers also see higher productivity growth, then I feel that would justify even further the wage evidence that you see. One, maybe another sort of competing story might be that there's unreported hours. So employees are basically just being paid for working more total. So their productivity per hour isn't increasing, but there's like hidden hours. And I wonder if maybe American Time Use Survey or other data sources might help rule that story out.
I was really encouraged to see your findings. This is so helpful, by the way. Thank you very much. I was encouraged to see your findings that mothers of young children are seeing a similar wage premium to remote work compared to other groups. But then I saw again that the number of hours worked per week were not going down for mothers as much as for other groups. So it seems like maybe they're working more for the same premium, which is especially frustrating given in my project, we find that women with children are perceived to be less likely to work extra hours. And I wonder if you can speak to that potential contradiction there.
Yeah, you can also, we should also take into account the fact that many mothers of young children have exited labor force, right, during the pandemic. And we're only looking at full-time, full-year employees. So we're not taking into account that impact yet.
Great work. A couple observations. One, Emma, on your comment. Kelly Yost has some data that, like pre-pandemic, the majority of remote workers were more often men than women in the first place. And I'm wondering how much this is a mix shift issue also, because if it was primarily a male-dominated set of workers versus now you've got more gender mix, what you may be observing is men's hours worked dropped off, partly because they're exposed to, God forbid, doing some housework and childcare during the pandemic. But that may be part of the mix that's going on. But my other question is, like, from a mix perspective, are you able to adjust for within occupation and industry levels of experience? Because at least anecdotally, I know a lot of Wall Street firms are wrestling with the fact that the people that they're convincing to come in 3 and 4 days a week are the younger, less experienced workers who are afraid of losing their jobs. It's their managers who are more often, it's the more experienced people that are staying home more often.
We are adjusting for occupations where management is one of the major occupations, and for age, which is the approximation of experience.
Thank you.
Many people here are familiar with the ACS data, but I just would like to remind that the way that the ACS asks the question confuses full-time remote with hybrid work. They ask you about how do you usually commute to work, which confuses both. And working with other data sets, one thing that I noticed is that it seems to be that the share of hybrid the share of hybrid as a share of all types of remote work seemed to be lower before the pandemic than it is now. So your results may mix both the change in attitudes towards work from home and the change in share of hybrid.
Yeah, absolutely. We also don't know how people whether they respond as hybrid or as remote when they go to work twice a week or 3 times. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was going to follow up. So it was great to see Shelby here as well. Certain stuff with Shelby. It was exactly on this point. If you look at the ACS question, it actually has 2 sentences. So the first thing is, where do you usually work, which you showed. The problem is it then has a second sentence, which is, please report the mode of transport used for most mileage. And so the problem is, even if you work from home 4 days a week, presumably that's 0 mileage. And then if you, commute in 1 day. So when we looked at Shelby, it looks like it's a measure of fully remote. because the numbers on this, it looks pretty much like a fully remote measure, which is great in some sense, but one question would be interesting if there's any other analysis. When you've looked at it, you look at the levels, it lines up very well with fully remote measures. And it depends which sentence you read. So the problem is that the question isn't that well designed, because the first sentence suggests include hybrid and the second suggests don't. And I don't really know, but I think it's mostly fully remote. Actually. But, I mean, Shelby's here, so we could also.
Thank you. At least compared to the SWAY survey, the ACS lines up mainly with fully remote, whereas the American Time Use Survey does seem to include more hybrid workers. So if you look more at us instead of the ACS, you may pick up more hybrid.
Yes, so next project is on the time use survey.
So, yeah, the ACS has got the interpretation problems that we just discussed, but it is a big data set, which is its advantage. And you won't be able to do things at such a granular level with the ATUS. But I wanted to first, just to clarifying question, the measure of the wage here is what? Hourly wage,
Salary-
weekly wage, annual?
Salary, so wage and salary income divided by number of weeks times usual hours of work.
Okay, so it's an hourly, I mean.
One measure refers to 12 months before, and the other measure of hours refers to a weekly usual, the
Okay,
hours
it's-
worked last week.
There's measurement error, but.
There's a little bit of that.
Of course, but it's an hourly wage measure,
Mhm,
basically. So that I didn't, maybe I missed it. You showed a lot of stuff. I didn't see any clean quantification that might allow us to get to how big the productivity effects are. And by the way, there's compensating differentials, there's productivity effects, and there's wage markdown effects, which you didn't mention. They could also be in the mix. I think we know from many other studies that it's not a compensating, what the evidence you showed us is not a compensating differential effect story, because all the evidence says the vast majority of workers like to work remotely. So and the only way to interpret your evidence through a compensating differentials is that they dislike the work remote. So I think we can set that aside. And so that it's some combination of productivity effects and shrinkage of, it could potentially be a shrinkage of wage markdowns. Okay, right? That's another possibility. But what I wanted to see, I don't think I saw, but what I wanted to see is, say, an occupation level analysis, the change from 2019 to 2021 or 2022 in the occupational wage, the mean occupational wage related to, I want to get a scatter plot, related to the occupation level change in the extent of remote work for those same occupations, and then controlling using the micro data for potential changes in the composition of the occupational level workforce over time. I don't think you showed anything quite like that. And it seems like it's the slope coefficient in that scatter plot that is telling me something. I'm going to set aside I'm going to assume it's not compensating differential story. That would actually go the other way. The slope coefficient in that scatter plot is informing me about some combination of productivity effects and wage markdown, shrinkage of wage markdown, increased productivity or shrinkage of wage markdown. That's kind of what I wanted to see at the end of the day, and I didn't see that. Maybe I missed it. Maybe it's in your regression somewhere, but I don't think you had quite that exercise.
Okay, we'll chat some more.
Okay.
So Jose is going to finish us off with why working from home will stick.
Great. So thanks everyone for sticking around to the end. So you may be wondering why I'm presenting this, given this is a paper that we wrote almost 2.5 years ago. We put it out as a working paper. And so I promise you, I'm going to try and show you a lot of new stuff and basically trying to add to the evidence that we got earlier on in the pandemic to think about some of the consequences of the big shift to working from home that we document in this paper and that we are going to stick based on the evidence that we originally documented in this paper. So kind of these are the original research questions that I think we were after in this work. So how much working from home will there be as the pandemic ends? I think we have a pretty good answer to that. Along the way, we collected a lot of evidence on the mechanisms that support a persistent shift to working from home. And so today I'm going to focus on this third part, which is what are the consequences of this persistent shift for workers and for productivity. And so basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to use data from our survey of working arrangements and attitudes, in particular data from late 2022 and early 2023, to present some key facts about how workers self-assess their productivity while working from home, and in particular how that relates to actual working from home outcomes. I'm going to use those facts to motivate a model for how workers and firms optimally choose working from home in 2023, and basically I use the structure of the model to infer the relative productivity of working from home from those observed choices via basically revealed preference arguments. And then kind of with that model that we calibrate to 2022 and 2023, we can basically conduct counterfactual exercises. What if we impose a return to office to the levels of 2019? What if we impose kind of lockdown levels of working from home as in 2020? Kind of how does that change aggregate outcomes in this model economy? All right, so what I want to do is again go take you through the facts. So the key results are that on average, workers say that they are more efficient while working from home. I think the key sort of new result here is that these self-assessments of relative productivity among people who have working from home experience are highly correlated with the amount of working from home that they're actually doing right now. And so this basically tells me that there's a strong revealed preference argument, and we can talk more about what this means. But I'm going to use this to basically as a condition to discipline the model a bit, and in order to conduct these counterfactuals. And so kind of the key counterfactual, I think, is if we force the economy to return to 2019 levels of working from home, in this economy that would lower GDP by a bit under a percentage point. Productivity would be, aggregate productivity, this is, would be lower by 0.3 to 1.3%, depending on how you measure it exactly. And welfare for the average worker would kind of, here we have a range of estimates, so it can be as small as 0.1% or 2% cut to welfare productivity, to welfare of the average worker. So let me start out with the facts about working from home productivity and preferences. And so and again, I'm going to be using SWAY data from late 2022 and 2023. I think I'm going to skip over the details about the SWAY. I think most of the people in this room are familiar enough about the survey. And I think, so in the background, notice that working from home has stuck at least up until the period that I'm going to be looking at. So I'm going to be taking data from late 2022, from about October until June of this year, when we basically see working from home stabilizing at about 28% of full paid working days in the US. And so during this period, workers are reporting higher relative efficiency of working from home, and according to their own self-assessment, compared to working in the office. So when we ask them, how does your efficiency while working from home compare to your efficiency while working on business premises? There's a big group that says that they're about equally efficient, but on balance, more people tell us that they're more efficient at home, and there's a lot of dispersion. So kind of people's experiences differ dramatically, and kind of, yes, on average, people tell us that they're about 7.8% more efficient while at home, but this is masking a huge amount of heterogeneity, which is kind of going to be one of the messages that I want you to take away from this. So here's, I think, my new result is that if we look at how much working from home people are doing in 2022 and 2023, that's on the horizontal axis here, that is very strongly related to the average self-assessment among each of these groups for how much better or worse they are while working from home. People who are working from home basically full time say that they're much more productive while doing so. People who say that who are not working from home right now are a lot less optimistic. And so I want you to take away more the gradient in these numbers than the overall level, because it could still be that these self-assessments are over optimistic. And so really what I'm going to use is basically this correlation. Finally, so to motivate the model, let me argue that what people like about working from home has a lot to do with how much time they save by doing so. So this and the same goes for their self-assessment. So here on the vertical axis, I have, again, their self-assessed relative efficiency of working from home, and on the horizontal axis, I have their two-way commute time, plus whatever extra grooming they do on days when they work from home. And there's clearly a positive relationship. So part of what makes me efficient while working from home is if I have a 2-hour two-way commute, that makes it really painful and makes my day kind of very inefficient. If I have a 10-minute commute, then I'm a lot more positive about working in the office compared to working from home. And we could see a very similar relationship when we think about worker preferences. So here the vertical axis is not people's self-assessed relative efficiency, it's how many days on average they would like to work from home in the long run, kind of their desired level that if in an ideal world. And then that is again, very much positively related to how long your commute. And so the model that I'm about to show you is going to have this element in terms of worker preferences. Kind of commutes are going to be painful to people, and that's why they're going to like to work from home. Okay, so here's the recap of the facts. On average, workers report higher efficiency while working from home. The self-assessed efficiency rises with working from home frequency. And these both preferences and self-assessments are strongly positively related to commuting and grooming time. And these facts are going to be embedded in the model that I'm about to show you. Okay, so here's the model sketch, and I'm going to try to minimize the equations as much as possible, but I couldn't manage to take them all out of the presentation, so bear with me. But basically, so the model is going to be a static economy with several groups of people. So there's going to be workers that are going to supply a number of hours per week. They're going to work a fraction of delta of their days from home. And they're going to receive a wage that can depend on the number of hours and on how much working from home they're doing. And they're going to consume the output good of this economy. There's going to be an intermediate firm that is going to hire these workers for a given number of hours per week. Again, a fraction of those hours are going to be work from home hours. And I'm going to make the assumption that the intermediate firm is a price taker, so they're going to take wages as given. And these firms are going to produce efficiency units of labor from these raw hours of work from a given work. And there's going to be a final goods firm that basically takes all of the efficiency units in the economy and transforms that to aggregate output. If you're a macroeconomist, you might like that part. I'm not going to say anything more about this final goods firm. It's just kind of to close the model. The equilibrium concept that I'm thinking about here is a static equilibrium in which, again, the firms are price takers, but the workers are going to internalize the impact on their pay of choosing a different amount of hours and choosing a different amount of working from home, especially kind of in the more complex versions of the model. That's going to be important. I think if there's one thing in this presentation that I'm not sure it's the final version is going to look like is the equilibrium concept. I think we're still experimenting there, and I can talk more about that if people are interested. So here's basically what workers look like in this economy. They get utility from consumption, and so they like making money, and they like working a little bit more because that allows them to consume more, but they dislike spending hours on work and on commuting. So kind of their total hours devoted to work, which they have this utility from, include the measured hours that they officially get paid for. They dislike, as well as kind of the baseline grooming that they do every day, and their commuting costs, which include kind of any extra grooming that you do when you go to the office. I don't know, it might take longer to put on makeup, to shave, put on a nice jacket to come into work, but you only have to incur those costs on days when you commute, not on days when you work from home. Okay, and the firm that hires these workers has a production function that looks like this. So each worker has an overall productivity shifter that is basically accounting for the human capital of an individual worker relative to others. And then this firm is going to generate efficiency units of labor by combining in-person hours with working from home hours. And kind of the new stuff here is in the working from home hours, where B is going to shift the relative productivity of those remote hours. And alpha, this parameter over here, is going to govern the substitutability of working from home and in-person work. And so we've had a lot of discussions over the past couple of days about how kind of some tasks are more amenable to remote work, some are not. And so we're going to make the assumption, and in our calibration, it's going to turn out that alpha is going to be less than 1. So there's effectively decreasing returns to having remote hours. So basically, kind of eventually, if you try to do everything remotely, kind of that last hour of remote has less returns than the first hour of remote work, because there are some tasks that are really poorly suited for doing remotely. Okay, and as I said, this firm, the assumption that I'm making today is they're going to be a price taker, and I should add that basically, in the data, there is a very strong evidence that when people don't commute, they actually work more hours. So some of the time that they save when they don't commute, they devote to their job. And so I'm not showing you in the equations that I'm putting up on here how that enters, because that really makes the math more complicated. But in all of the final numbers that I'm going to show you today, I'm going to take into account that basically when workers don't commute, they work a little bit longer, and that's going to change a bunch of the numbers that I'm going to show you. Okay, so the nice thing about this model, and again, these are the equations that come out of the very simplest version, is that based on the equilibrium conditions and on what firms and workers are optimally choosing, I can infer a lot of these unobservables. So I can infer what the relative productivity of a given worker is, what the relative, so given alpha, I can infer the relative productivity of working from home B for every individual worker in our data. Okay, and basically all I need to do is to calibrate alpha. And so here's where I'm going to use the fact that self-assessments are predictive of how much workers are actually working from home. So I'm going to try to minimize, so I'm going to choose an alpha that minimizes the distance between these Bs that I infer from the model and the self-assessments that I get just from the raw survey data. And that's going to give me an alpha of 0.97. That tells me that basically remote hours are very close to perfectly substitutable with working with in-person hours, but not perfectly substitutable. Okay, so here's basically the distribution of productivity shifters that I get. So these are this is the vector of B's for a bunch of these people. The relative productivity working from home seems to be 0 because we see so many people in 2022 and 2023 basically not doing any remote work at all. That's so the model is basically inferring that these people are terrible at their jobs when they're remote, and that applies to about 60% of the sample here. On the other hand, there's a lot of people for whom there is a relative productivity of working from home that is positive. For many of those, that B is greater than 1, and B is greater than 1. B being greater than 1 means that there are lots of returns to doing remote work for these people. Okay, and if you want, so just as a sanity check, so I calculated the average B, so this average relative productivity shifter across industries, and you see this makes a lot of sense. So in information, finance, and insurance, we see the average B is quite high. In transportation, warehousing, hospitality, and food services, it's a lot lower. And then basically what's going on in the background is what's really determining these Bs through the structure of the model is how much people are actually working from home in our data, and kind of our measures of working from home are giving exactly these patterns. All right, so let me move on to the counterfactuals. So what are the consequences of changing working from home levels from changing working from home levels to what we saw in 2019? So basically the thought experiment that I'm doing is I'm going to exogenously set working arrangements and then solve for the new equilibrium in this counterfactual economy and compare aggregate outcomes in that counterfactual to the aggregate outcomes in the model calibrated to 2022 and 2023. And so 2019 working from home levels here are going to mean that basically you only work from home about 10% of the time if you're currently doing it to any extent. So anybody who is not working from home now won't in 2019. And basically anybody who is in hybrid or fully remote now is going to be scaled down to a level of working from home where they come into the office about once every where they stay at home about once every 2 weeks. The rest of the time they're in the office. And so here's what we get in terms of impact for the aggregate economy. So GDP goes down by almost 1%. Measured productivity in the sense of output per measured hour goes down by 0.3%. But I think one of the important lessons of this exercise is if we really think that basically in a world where you have to commute, you should really count those inputs into producing market output. If I then add into my hours of input and into my measure of hours worked, all of the commuting and grooming time, this effect on productivity basically multiplies by 4. Okay. There are also potentially some big impacts on welfare. So if we hold prices constant, we get that workers on average are worse off by an equivalent of 1.6% of consumption. In equilibrium, that sort of washes out to a much smaller number. But I think the bigger point when I think about worker welfare is that there's a lot of heterogeneity, and so here this is the distribution of changes in welfare for individual workers from going from 2022, 2023 to the counterfactual. And yeah, so I can give you an average number, but there is so much heterogeneity here that it makes me think that the average number is almost meaningless. And kind of across all the counterfactuals that I've calculated, the amount of dispersion is so huge that it kind of is meaningless to think about the average number. All right, so let me very quickly. So going to 2019 has some negative consequences on the economy. Productivity goes down, GDP goes down. Let me just do two more thought experiments to give you an idea of the sorts of things that we can do with this model that I think are a big contribution of this exercise. So what happens to an economy when we impose 2020 levels of working from home? So basically, in this case, I'm thinking about imposing working from home at 100% for anybody who remotely can, and not if you obviously cannot. So kind of what happens in this world? Well, it turns out this is also very costly. So kind of even if I try to make things not as serious as, even if I try to find a calibration of the model that is not as negative as it could be, I get that the cost of going to lockdown levels of working from home is about 11% of GDP, 11% or 10% of in terms of productivity. So kind of lockdown is very, very costly. And I can do the same thing with worker desires. So in this way, I think one of our more successful questions that we've been asking more or less continuously since 2020 was this question of how much would you like to work from home after the pandemic? And so with this model, I can make a small modification so that instead of people liking working from home because they avoid commuting, maybe they have a preferred level of working from home. And they experience a loss if they're not at that level, and I can be a little bit agnostic as to where these preferences are coming from, and I can do a counterfactual where I give everybody their preferred level of working from home. So what comes out of this exercise is, again, this is quite costly to the economy. So workers fail to internalize the productivity benefits of being in the office. And so kind of if we give all of them exactly what they want in terms of working from home, the model is saying that GDP would drop by about 5%, measured productivity by 4%, and kind of our expanded measure of productivity by a similar amount. So again, this is very costly. So let me leave it there. But basically what I want you to get out of this is, I think this is in some sense an advertisement for the SWAY in the sense that we have many data points, and we've asked many different questions that can tell us about how workers and employers are choosing working from home. And if we impose some structure on these data by thinking about a model like the one that I showed you, we get that we can do these counterfactual experiments that tell us things like forced return to 2019 leads to a 0.3 to 1.3% loss in productivity. It matters for worker welfare, and there's a lot of heterogeneity there. And we looking forward to see what people think. This is absolutely fresh, even though this is a 2.5-year-old paper. So thanks for listening, and hope to hear what you want to say.
So first of all, this is a paper I guess all of us have read many times. So these are really cool new results, and you've done enough for one paper. So this, I don't know if these suggestions are super helpful, but I was thinking about the intermediate firm and whether you can also add a matching model there, because I imagine that firms which offer more work from home would attract, there'll be some selection in terms of better quality workers. And the reason I say that is in your counterfactual analysis, instead of scaling up and down uniformly for all firms, you could scale up and down heterogeneously. And then you could even tell us the predictions about what would firms that scale down less or more, what kind of productivity impacts would they see?
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. And that's the sort of counterfactual that I think we can we can think about structuring in this environment.
Yeah, this is fantastic. As somebody who spent a lot of time trying to model work from home, I'm glad to see that you have a model. So, and by the way, in our work, we use a very, very similar structure of the model. And one of the pushbacks that we receive all the time is, what about firms? So in your setting, workers decide entirely how much they want to work from home, and firms just take whatever output workers produce and pay for it, right? Whereas what we see in practice is that very often firms are very proactively deciding work from home policies. And if anything, they choose how much workers work from home, or at least in some kind of collaboration with the worker, right? And I'm just curious to hear your thoughts how the model could be amended to take into consideration what firms want to do.
Yeah, so I think that's a great point, and I think conceptually, knowing what is the mechanism at which firms and workers have arrived at the current level of working from home is difficult. And so I took one stand in the presentation. I've solved a different version of the model where the worker takes as given what the firm wants to do, and the equilibrium is set that way. And so these are the numbers from that version. You get something fairly similar. So I'd say kind of for the 2019 numbers, they're a little bit bigger. So it's 1.9 instead of 0.9, it's 0.8 and 2.1. But I think the key lessons are in some sense the same, that there are costs of productivity and output of if we force a return to 2019. And if we take into account that commuting hours are potentially an input into producing market activity, again, kind of my productivity number in this case multiplies by more than 2.
The CEOs are arguing that people need to come back to the office. So are they right or wrong? First line says that they're wrong. The last line says that they're right. So which one is it?
So, I mean, so let me be very clear. Here, I'm assuming that basically the equilibrium in 2022 and 2023 is set to optimize what workers are doing and in some sense what firms are doing. So any deviation from that should generate a loss. The question is how much. And I think so. People who want a full return to office, these are the potential costs that you should be willing to take. I think, yeah, telling the workers, oh, you can just do whatever you want, that's also going to be very costly. It's going to be more costly, but I don't know that it's in the cards to give every single worker at white collar firms exactly the amount of working from home that they want. I don't think anybody would realistically give that. I think it might be easier for me to buy that people are realistically thinking that we need to come back to 2019 levels of working from home. And so that's why I think that's the focal counterfactual.
Oh, so interesting. Just a couple of questions. One is the main measurement of time and the commute. Does that mean that you can expect those countries and cities with smaller geographies and different topographies to in fact show different figures? And the second question is the other forms of measurement, which is, I believe, without the data to back it up, but I believe very strongly that there are other non-commute reasons why people are reluctant to go back to work in the old ways, not least the toxic workplace, bad management. How can you begin to start to measure that, if at all?
Yeah, so both great questions. I'd say, yeah. So I think this model is telling us that the commuting costs are a big component. And to the extent that commuting is less painful because transit systems work more appropriately, traffic is better, I think that's going to definitely lower the costs of going back in person because people are going to be happy to do it. They're going to cut back on their hours less when you force them to commute. And so I mean, definitely we can say more on that, but I think that's the direction that it would go. In terms of preferences, I think so the first version of this model that I didn't really incorporate any preference heterogeneity. But then I realized, hey, actually, we have a very good measure of preference heterogeneity that we've been collecting since 2020. So in the sense that we know how much each person in our data would like to ideally work from home. And so it took me a while to find the exact specification of the model that would work, but I can give you, but we can very much quantify kind of what is the value to these people of doing exactly what they want, and we can definitely do more on that, and look at patterns as to how this varies by observables like gender or age, et cetera, as well as unobservables.
Elaborate on two sets of remarks. Just first, what Jose was saying, because we can either use the data directly or we can use it as filtered through the model. It is telling us something about how much people have a desire to work from home, conditional on their commuting and their productivity characteristics. We can go back to the individual level data and relate the average values of these gamma I's to a whole set of observable characteristics.
Exactly.
Gender, education, marital status, kids in the household, and so on. So even though we haven't done it yet, we have a data set and a framework that's very well suited to addressing the issues you raised. So second thing, back on this question about, well, two more things. You know, are the CEOs right or the workers right? Well, in that last line says the CEOs are right from a productivity perspective. Doesn't mean they're right from a welfare perspective. Okay, so the people are making these productivity wage reducing choices, but they're nonetheless better off. Okay,
that's right. So workers are on average better off if we give them what they want. That's right. That's totally right.
So I just wanted to make that clear. The third thing, you know, back on this issue that you raised about, you know, employers differ. You know, employers are offering different contracts. So for just two things. First, Jose went over this part quickly, but the employers in this model are offering a wage, which is a function of both your hours and the worker's choice of working arrangements. That thing is determined in equilibrium. Okay, they're competitive firms, but it's determined in equilibrium. So that wage bundle, so wage working arrangement bundle, so to speak, is an equilibrium object in this model. This version of the model has one intermediate firm. There's nothing to inhibit us from taking this model and have two different kinds of intermediate firms that have different technologies for transforming hours and working arrangements into labor services. They can both be operating in a competitive market and competing with each other. What does that allow us to do? Within basically the same kind of competitive equilibrium structure, we can have two or even N firms offering different kinds of wage working arrangement bundles in the market to capture some of this evident heterogeneity that we see in the real world, where the Elon Musk, Jamie Dimons of the world, they seem to be operating with a different production technology than firms that are quite willing to accommodate flexible working arrangements. So that's not in the current version of the model, but it's well within our scope to do that in this framework. And I don't think it's analytically any harder than what we've already done. It's just another layer of heterogeneity.
So if I've understood your model, you know, the equilibrium is always optimal from a productivity standpoint. And so the counterfactuals that you're talking about here are not counterfactuals that you'd ever really see, because they're counterfactuals that would reduce productivity. And so I'm wondering if you'd considered calculating counterfactuals that involve changing some of the parameters in the model that I think of as really exogenous. So I guess that would maybe be the gamma I's, because those are counterfactuals that we might actually see in the world and lead to a new optimal conditional on the gamma I's, a new equilibrium. Maybe the way to do that is to do what you just said, which is to project the gammas onto observables, and then that would allow you to ask questions like, you know, if people's preferences were different, what would the level of work from home be? What would the productivity implications be? If, you know, men and women had more similar types of preferences, if, you know, commute times were lower, those types of questions.
Yeah, no, so I think that's an excellent suggestion. I mean, maybe I would think about it slightly differently. So I'd say kind of the productivity shifters for working from home that we're inferring here are basically embedding any changes in technology and human capital, basically embedding all of the learning and changes and investments that we've experienced over the past 3 years that enable working from home now in its current form. And yeah, and I think of so maybe the thought experiment that is coming to mind right now is basically how much would we have to shift these B's to get workers and firms to choose to go back to the office as in 2019. Kind of that's the counterfactual that I'm thinking about now, or the thought experiment that I'm thinking about.
Part of what this is really interesting. It's making my head spin a little bit. Going back to some of what Steve was saying in response to Julia and Raj's earlier conversation, it'd be really interesting to me to actually find a way that you could actually model out different behaviors of firms and what impact that has, or how this actually works across demographics. If I'm wrapping my head around it right, the answer to the CEO question is it's worse, because the answer to the employee question, if the CEO gets what they want, that's not what we are doing today. So therefore, it's going to drag us back in a different direction. But also, if the employee gets what they want, things get worse, because we're starting off with an assumption that we're at an optimal, in 22, 2023. So neither of those people are actually right. Ends up being the answer if you just look at it on that face value. I think it'd be much more interesting to look at this in some way in which you could model out what if firms behave differently and that attracted labor towards them, because that's what's happening in the market. We're seeing it in the real world, right? Firms are actually applying within every single industry. There are examples of people that are applying different models, and they're doing it on the basis to attract talent, not because they necessarily think they're going to save on real estate. So that's what I think would be really interesting out of this, if there's a way to do it.
Yeah, I think I need to think about how to operationalize that, but it's definitely an interesting thought experiment.
This is super cool. I think probably somewhat motivated by my work and Charlie's work. I think it would be interesting to try to think about spillovers across workers. I understand that that's probably going to be tough to do, but if I recall correctly, you have some question about like preferences about coworkers coming in.
Yeah, and we haven't
like,
used any of that.
Yeah, like I feel like on either putting it in as a preference shifter or as a productivity shifter, it would be interesting to think about, like, if we're thinking of a coordination problem within the firm, like how would you put that into this model?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So off the top of my head, I think Charlie's better suited to thinking about and modeling spillovers than I am, given my skill set. But I think those are super important questions, and maybe there is a way that we can use exactly this, again, this question that we've asked in the survey, and think about, okay, how does that show up in the model and incorporate it?
Have you asked anything about how coworkers coming in impacts their productivity?
Yeah, so we asked about mentoring, and we asked it about preferences, but not about their self-assessed productivity while at work or in the office with co-location. No.
I'm wondering how you're thinking about the nature of the pandemic shock to working from home. When I look at the model, it looks as if maybe you're thinking that it involved investment in new technologies that made it easier to work from home, and that's where all the action is coming from, and now we're in a new state. But it also seems to me there's likely some amount of, given how well some people managed to work in 2020, it seems to me there's also likely some amount of firms were poorly informed about what was possible. And so how do we think about that difference? What kind of, there was a forced experiment that nobody had been willing to take before that taught us about technology versus we invested in technology to improve things.
Yeah, so the best I can say is kind of the parts of the paper that I haven't shown you are using data that we collected earlier in the pandemic to make exactly these arguments, that there was a forced experiment, that people were forced to learn that on average, what they thought before the pandemic was overly pessimistic, that they made investments into working from home. And so I think how I think of the model is again, I'm calibrating it to data in late 2022 and 2023, likely after all these dynamics have subsided. And so now kind of what we observe people doing late in 2022 and 2023 incorporates those investments, incorporates that learning, incorporates those changes in human capital that are enabling working from home to persist to the levels that we see now, and taking the counterfactuals basically from that baseline.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.